Okay, welcome back. Let's take a look at table widths and cell widths. So I'm going to delete that table from the last lesson, create a new one, and let's give this a border of 1. And let's just create some default content in here. We've got a table row, table cell, cell in here. Standard table, we should be somewhat familiar with that by now. So if I go over to my browser, and this is from the last video, if I just refresh, I've got a cell in here. It's not taking up very much space. Maybe I want it to take up 50% of the space on this page. And so if I just zoom out, you can actually see it's super, super tiny. And what I can do is I can say width is equal to 50%. So far, I've been saying width is equal to 100%, and it takes up all this width through here. But now I'm saying actually only take up 50%. And I can go into responsive mode here, and I can see that as my page gets smaller, so does that table. Now that's actually super, super hard to see because that's super, super tiny, but it is becoming smaller and smaller. So it is maintaining that 50% width. And all I did there was click this little icon in Google Chrome, and that sends me into responsive mode. So you can see how things are going to look like on tablets, on mobile, things like that. Now I'm just going to zoom back in here, and let's change this back to 100% because I want to use more width so I can take up more real estate just for demonstration purposes in the video. It just looks a little bit better. You don't have to follow exactly what I'm doing. So I'm going to add a second row in here. And let's say I had a cell in here and I didn't want it to take up exactly 50% of the table. So what our browser here is doing is saying, hey, there's a table. It's 100% width. There's 2 cells. 100 divided by 2 is each one is 50%. That's all it's doing here. But let's say I wanted that first one to be smaller. We could say in here, width is equal to, and let's give it a 20% in here. Now, before I show you what that looks like, I also want to mention that you can get rid of the percent sign and you can do this in pixels as well. Now that's a little bit harder. It's a little more hard-coded, not always what you want. Percent is usually what people are looking for. But you could also say, instead of a width of 100%, you could say a width of 500 pixels. But I'm going to stick with percentage for now. So I save that, refresh my page, and you can see that this cell actually got smaller. Now you're probably thinking, well, what's the use of that? But if I do this, I can do a new table row, a new cell in here, and I can do colspan of equal to, it's supposed to be equal to 2, so it's like there's 2 of them, but it's going to be merged together. Welcome to my website. And in this one, the one where the width is only 20%, we could say something like H3. Let's put this on new lines so we can read it. H3, navigation, and in here we could do H3, content. Let's go ahead and refresh this, and we can see welcome to my website. That's like the title of my page. We've got navigation, so we can make a list of links in there, and we can put some content in here. So now we're working on an actual layout. Now what I would like you to do is create a table, and with just one particular cell, I want you to tell it exactly how wide it should be. Give it a width. And as a recap, all we did there was add the width attribute to either the table or the cell. In my case, I did both, so the table's 100% width, and then I said the cell should be 20% of that table width. Okay, let's take a look at table headers. Now this one's actually super easy because we've been using the TD element for table data cell. Let's go ahead and use a table header, and all we do here is TH. And I'm going to change this to an HTML file. TH represents a header cell in a table. Let's go ahead and change the closing tag as well. And you're going to see from the last lesson to this lesson, this is what it used to look like, and this is what it's going to look like as soon as I hit refresh. It's now centered and bold. That's a table header. And that's really all there is to it. A table header works the exact same way as a table data cell. The only difference is instead of TD, we said TH. That's it. Nice and short. Once you think you got a hang of that, let's head on over to that next lesson, and I'll meet you over there. Okie dokie, welcome back. Let's take a look at inline CSS. Now, we actually already covered this in the very first lesson, where we said style is equal to text decoration underline. We can do that on pretty much every single element in the body of our page. And by body, I mean the body element. So any element in here, we can add that style attribute to. So let's go ahead and create a div. And in here, let's give it a style attribute, and let's change a few things. And I'm just going to give you a little glimpse into CSS. So let's give it a padding of like 40 pixels. Let's give it a font color of white and a background color of, let's say, black, so we can read it nicely on the screen. And in here, I can say lorem tab, and that's all I'm going to do. So you can actually see the syntax here. And at this point, I probably don't need to explain this syntax to you anymore, but just for good housekeeping, let's go through it anyways. So I created a div, space, style is the attribute, is equal to, and then I have everything between quotation marks. Then I've got a CSS declaration in here. So this whole thing is a declaration. You don't need to remember the CSS part, by the way. But this is a CSS declaration. We're saying add padding 40 pixels to the top, right, bottom, and left. Change the font color to white, background color to black, and in between each of these declarations, such as this one, we have a semicolon. So it's a little different than HTML, but still very, very readable. And this whole thing here is called inline CSS. So let's go back to our page, and I'm going to hit refresh. And look at that. With just a little bit of effort and knowing just a tiny amount of CSS, we were able to create a padding in here. So we've got spacing here, over here, over here, and over here. We change the background color to black and the font color to white. We can also right-click Inspect. And if I click on this particular element, we can toggle these on and off. This is what padding does. We can change that padding to be higher or lower if we wanted to, which is what we're doing here. And all I did was click in there and I hit the up arrow or down arrow. You can also type if you wanted to. If you wanted to, you could scroll all the way down in this little window here, and you can see that it'll tell you right away that there's a padding of 40 on all four sides. And that is inline CSS. That's really all there is to it. And we can write all of our CSS in there. Now, that's actually not a very good way to do it, but occasionally you're going to see that that's actually going to be required. And this is just something that you should be very aware of. Now, this CSS, again, at this point in time, do not feel like you need to know this. After you're finished HTML 201, this course, definitely feel free to pick up CSS. I have a course on CSS called the CSS Masterclass. It's a huge, huge course. It goes through everything you could think of. But for now, let's just keep focusing on HTML. Now, if you want to follow along and do exactly what I did, go ahead and pause the video and give us a padding. Remember, it goes whatever we're trying to change, colon, space, and then a value, and then a semicolon. And then what we're trying to change, like the color, colon, space, and then the value, and then a semicolon. And that's how we put 3 in a row like that. So feel free to give that a shot or not. And when you're done, when you're comfortable, when you're ready, let's head on over to that next lesson. All right, as we dive more and more into HTML, we're going to end up transitioning a little bit more into CSS. And in this lesson, I want to show you exactly how we can do that right away. So in the last lesson, we looked at padding color and white background, white color and background color of black. Now let's say we wanted to add that to another div. And so we could write another div in here, and we could fill this with some lorem ipsum, and then we would have to copy and paste this like that. Which is not a big deal, but if we have that 20 or 30 times, and then we have to make one change to all of them, so let's say we needed to change white to blue, and change white to blue here, we have to do that 20 times. And that gets really, well, for lack of a better term, it gets really irritating, and it takes way too long. There's a better way to live your life. So I'm going to, first of all, create another div here, and these could just as easily be paragraphs. And let's go ahead and see what we have on our page. We've got a lorem ipsum, a lorem ipsum, and a lorem ipsum. So we've got 1, 2, and 3. Now let's say I wanted to apply this styling to this third one, but not the second one. What we could do is we could actually pull this style attribute out into a style element. Now it just happens to be that they're named the same thing. You can't necessarily pull an attribute name out and turn it into an element and just hope that it works. But in this case, we can. So it's just coincidence there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of that, delete it, come up here, paste that in my style. And so this is not going to do anything, but what I'm looking at here is reusability. So I have this div and I have this div, and I want to be able to give these three attributes, these three CSS attributes to both of them. And we can do this with a CSS class. And we can say class name here. I'm just going to select those three, move them back up, put them in there. And so this syntax looks a little weird. We're not going to spend too much time here, but the class starts with a dot, then the name. There's no spaces or anything in it. It is case sensitive, curly brackets, and then the stuff we put inside of our style attribute that we now put into a style element. And what we can do here is I'm going to copy this, but first and foremost, I want to show you that when I refresh the page, nothing happens. My console's not breaking. It's not complaining. I just have 3 divs with lorem ipsum in it. And what I want to do here is say, in this first one, class is equal to class name here. And you can see VS Code is trying to autofill that for me. And I could also do class is equal to class name here. And so instead of writing style is equal to padding is 40 pixels, color is white, background color is black, instead of writing that twice, we wrote it once. Looks a little different. And we said class is equal to class name here, class is equal to class name here. Now when I refresh my page, I save that and refresh the page, you'll see that it applies the styling to both sections for me. Now, careful with typos here because I'm using uppercase and lowercase characters here, but if you don't do it right, and I purposely typoed that one, it's not going to show up, but your console's not going to complain either. So you have to keep an eye out for that. Make sure you're typing things properly. If that means you type slower, that means you type slower. That's okay. Now the other thing with classes is we can add multiple classes. So we could add another class here, call it uppercase, and we could do text transform uppercase. Now I already know these because I write a lot of CSS in my day-to-day life. But VS Code is also pretty helpful here. So as soon as I typed text, you can see it's trying to give me all sorts of different options in here. There's a lot to CSS. Again, you don't need to memorize all of it if you don't really want to. You can always just figure out how to Google it. As long as you can figure out how to get the answer, that's what's important. But going back to classes. So I have a second class here. Again, class starts with a dot. That's what this means. It's a lot like saying dot is equal to, or up here, it's a lot like saying class is equal to. We just use dot as a shorthand sort of method. And then let's make one of these uppercase. And we can add uppercase to the second one. Now we need to add a space in here. If you don't add a space, it just looks like this. And your browser is going to think that the class name is called class name here uppercase, like all one word. It's not. It's class name here, space, and then uppercase as well. And we can add more and more and more if we wanted to, as long as they actually do something. So I've got class name here, space, uppercase. And when I refresh this, we should see that this inherits the same styling, but should also be all uppercase. And look at that. It's like it's shouting at me. And that's all there is to really classes in HTML. A class is a reusable piece of code. It has this little dot here that says it's a class. It has this sort of syntax. Again, you don't need to know this part at this point in time. Please focus on the HTML. The HTML that we want to focus on is the attribute called class and how it works. We can have one class name, space, second class name, space, third class name, so on and so on and so on. Okay, welcome back. We have one more thing to cover when it comes to CSS, and it's this idea of an ID. And we've actually done this when we were creating internal links. So we can create a link that goes to bottom, or like this one, a link that goes back up to the top of the page. But we're using this ID attribute here, and we can actually style things based on an ID as well. So in the last lesson, we took a look at classes. Classes use a period. But if I scroll on back down here, you can actually see that an ID, like I'm linking here back up to the top, ID is equal to top. But down here, I'm still linking to it with a number sign top, and that's going to bring me back up to ID top. Now what that is saying is basically number sign is equal to top. ID is equal to top. It's the same thing. So if we scroll on down, inside of our style attribute here, we can create an ID. Testing ID. And in here, and you'll see that it starts with a number sign. No spaces, no special characters. It's just regular text in here. So don't try to get too fancy with your class names or your ID names. In here, we could do something like border, 5 pixels, solid red. Let's actually make this a lot more obnoxious and do 15 pixels solid red. Now, out of the box, this is not going to do anything because we haven't applied this particular testing ID anywhere. Let's go ahead and add it to this middle one. So we've got 3 divs here. We've got a top div with class name here, bottom div with class name here and uppercase. And in the middle, we have ID is equal to, scroll up, testing ID. And you can see that these both match right here. Now, the thing with IDs is they are supposed to be 100% unique. Now, browsers don't always honor that, but JavaScript will always run into a problem if you have 2 IDs that are the same. So you don't really need to know what that means at this point in time, but what you do need to know is an ID is just like your driver's license. There should only ever be one copy of it. There should only ever be one version of it. That's your ID. So let's go back to our browser here, and when I hit refresh, we're going to see a 15 pixel red border around here. Just like that, super obnoxious. So just like classes, we can select things by IDs and then add styling to it. And that's where this ID attribute comes from. Now there's nothing to do here. Don't worry, you don't have to actually know all of this right now. You're going to get tons of experience with this in CSS and JavaScript when you go and learn those things. But for now, again, let's just keep focusing on HTML. It's just good to know that there's a class attribute and an ID attribute, and this is how it works. Oh, and one last thing, you don't add multiple IDs here. So like how we have class name here, and then a space and then uppercase, and that is selecting this stuff and this stuff. With an ID, we don't do that. With an ID, we just say there's one single thing in here. So we don't do testing ID and another one and another one. We don't do that. We just say there's one. So let that sink in for a couple of minutes. Feel free to meet me over in that next lesson, and we'll get back to HTML. Okay, welcome back. Let's take a look at a few different ways to format code. Format code, or code formatting. The first way is this pre-tag, P-R-E. And if we just hover over that long enough, MDN is going to tell us that the pre-tag is a pre-element that represents a block of pre-formatted text in which structure is represented by type of blah, 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 blah. The most important thing here is that it represents pre-formatted text. Some stuff here, and let's go ahead and let's just check out what this looks like at first. So that's near the bottom here. And look at that. It actually did something weird. It added a bunch of spaces. So in HTML 101, if you remember, I preached about this a lot. HTML, or not HTML, but your browser does not care about white space. However, there are a couple cases where it does. Pre is one of those cases. So the pre-tag is very white sensitive. And what if we did a second line here? Second line here. Now in regular HTML, we need to add a BR or some sort of block element to get onto a new line like this. But we actually don't need to do that. Not in a pre-tag anyways. In a pre-tag, look at that, shows up perfectly. Now the thing to keep in mind is that the pre-tag cares about white space. So let's go ahead and add a bunch of spaces here. Make this just look real terrible. It also lines up our text, by the way, so it doesn't really matter what our default font is, because our text editor is going to try to make sure that every font is mono, or every letter is monospaced, so that H is the same width as E, is the same width as R, is the same width as E, is the same width as I, is the same width as Z, is the same width as M. Yeah, you get the point. In the pre-tag, it's going to do the exact same thing. Whereas if you look at here, that R is not as wide as the F. Whereas here, the SOME, they're all the same width. Even the spaces are the same width. That is called monospacing. So that's one way to format your code. Another way to format your code is, if we wanted to do something inline, because pre is a block element, we could say, let's add some lorem text here, code, /code. And this is going to be inline for us, and this is going to make it look a little more code-like, a little more like this. And look at that. It actually took lorem ipsum dolor sit, I don't know. And it formatted it a lot like this. Now, is it white space sensitive? Let's explore. Let's add a bunch of spaces between lorem and ipsum. This one is not white space sensitive. Would you look at that? But pre is white space sensitive. So that's a good distinction to keep in mind. So I'm just going to undo that because that's not needed. And those are two ways in which you can format your code. So you can write some code like this. It's still going to try to render HTML inside of it. Don't forget about that. You're still going to need HTML entities. That's a thing we'll talk about in the future. But you can still format your code like this or like this. Block element, inline element, pre, code element. Okay, let's take a look at HTML entities. Now, in the last lesson, we looked at pre and code elements. And let's say I wanted to put something in here like B, this is bold. And let's say I actually wanted to display this. I didn't necessarily want to just say, like, this is bold text. I wanted to actually show this tag. Now, we're going to run into a problem. When I hit refresh, it just bolds my text. So it's still rendering regular HTML, and that's not what we want. We actually want this tag to show up. Now, we have these things called HTML elements. And an HTML element starts with an ampersand, or the and ends with a semicolon. And it's really just shortcuts to show less than, greater than, copyright, things like that. Now, there are so many of them, I cannot possibly cover all of them, and you're going to have to do a little Googling for it. But we can do less than, which is this symbol here, B, and then we can do ampersand, greater than, GT. And this looks really, really weird, but what this is going to do is turn it into that, and this one is going to turn it into that, but only while we're displaying it. So let's go ahead and refresh our page, and we can see that this now actually shows up. Let's go ahead and copy this whole thing over to our closing B tag, and let's add a slash in here. Look at that. So our text is no longer bold, and it's showing us the HTML tags. Now we can do the same thing, the exact same thing, inside of our code element that we used in our last class, or last lesson. Same thing. And we don't have to do it inside of the code element. We could do it really anywhere. It doesn't really matter. You'll see down here says B, this is bold. So that's an HTML element, or an entity. And an entity, all it is taking some sort of way of regularly reading the code that your browser would try to interpret and showing it the way you want to show it in a human readable way. Now, a really good example is if we were to add like a footer to our page here. So let's say this is our footer. We could say something like, and copy, and then we could put the year in here. So we could put like 2022, if that's the year. Scroll on down, and there it is, a copyright. Now, just for funsies, I'm going to throw in two extras here. We can do sup for super, and that makes it up. So it brings it up a little bit instead of being centered. And we can also do sub, S-U-B, for subscript, superscript and subscript. And that brings it down. So I'm going to undo that. Feel free to play with those if you like to, but they're not really necessary. I just thought I would throw them in there for fun because they're sort of working along lines of copyright. Copyright's usually that little tiny C at the top of a line. You'd use superscript for that.